January 27th, 1942, marked the day when destiny began assembling over the skies of America. The conference room in Washington hummed with tension as General Henry Harley Arnold leaned over maps of Europe, his weathered hands tracing invisible routes across the Atlantic. Behind closed doors, military planners were crafting something unprecedented, an aerial armada that would carry the war directly into the heart of Nazi Germany. The 8th Air Force officially came into existence on that winter day, born from desperation and determination. While Japanese bombs still smoldered in Pearl Harbor's wreckage and German U-boats terrorized Atlantic convoys, America needed a weapon that could strike back across an ocean. The concept was audacious, thousands of heavy bombers flying in broad daylight, challenging the Luftwaffe for control of European skies. Colonel Ira Clarence Eaker arrived in England on February 20th, 1942, commanding just 6 officers and a briefcase full of plans. The modest beginning belied the massive force that would follow. British military leaders expressed polite skepticism when Eaker outlined American daylight bombing strategy. The Royal Air Force had already learned painful lessons about daytime raids, shifting their operations to darkness after catastrophic losses. But Americans believed their heavily armed Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses could defend themselves through tight formations and coordinated firepower. Preparations consumed the spring and summer. Across England's green countryside, construction crews transformed peaceful farmland into sprawling air bases. Runways stretched like concrete ribbons through villages that had known only horse-drawn carts. Quonset huts shrouded alongside ancient hedgerows, and control towers rose where church steeples once dominated horizons. Local residents watched with mixture of curiosity and trepidation as American servicemen flooded into East Anglia, transforming sleepy market towns into bustling military centers. The first bomber crews began arriving in late spring, young men barely out of their teens carrying swagger that masked profound anxiety. They came from Iowa farms and New York tenements, Texas ranches and Michigan factories, unified by belief in their mission and terrified of what awaited. Training intensified at bases like Polbrook, Molesworth, and Grafton Underwood. Pilots practiced formation flying until movements became instinctive. Bombardiers spent hours perfecting their aim through Norden bomb sites. Gunners learned to track fast-moving fighters while freezing air numbed their fingers. According to historical records maintained by the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the 8th initially struggled with equipment shortages and organizational challenges that delayed combat operations for months. August 17, 1942, finally brought the moment everyone awaited. 12 B-17 bombers lifted from Grafton Underwood's runway, bound for railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. General Eaker himself flew aboard one bomber, refusing to send men into danger he wouldn't face. Royal Air Force Spitfires escorted the small formation across the English Channel, British pilots still doubting daylight tactics could succeed. The raid achieved complete surprise. German defenders barely reacted before bombs tumbled toward targets. All 12 fortresses returned safely, crews grinning with relief and adrenaline as they touched down. It seemed almost too easy, this first taste of combat. Newsreels captured jubilant airmen celebrating their maiden mission, propaganda value enormous for a nation hungry for good news. But seasoned officers knew the truth. Rouen represented only the beginning, a gentle introduction to warfare that would soon reveal its true face. Deeper into Germany lay heavily defended industrial centers protected by experienced fighter pilots and dense anti-aircraft artillery. The 8th Air Force had announced its presence. Now came the hard part, proving daylight bombing could actually work when the Luftwaffe committed its full strength to stopping them. October 9, 1942, brought the 8th Air Force its first genuine understanding of what German air defenses could accomplish. 108 B-17 and B-24 Liberator bombers launched against steel plants in Lille, France, anticipating another straightforward mission like previous raids. Instead, Luftwaffe fighters swarmed them with coordinated ferocity that shocked American crews. 4 bombers failed to return, 21 men gone in flames and twisted metal. The losses stung but remained statistically acceptable. Planners had calculated expected casualty rates, grim mathematics treating young lives as percentages on spreadsheets. What troubled commanders more was how effectively German fighters exploited weaknesses in American formations. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacked from head-on, discovering that flying fortresses carried limited forward-firing armament. Pilots watched helplessly as cannon shells ripped through cockpits before defensive gunners could engage. Through late 1942 and early 1943, the 8th gradually expanded operations while refining tactics. Bomber groups increased from dozens to hundreds of aircraft, creating aerial armadas that darkened skies. Formation flying became an art form as pilots learned to maintain precise positions despite turbulence, flak bursts, and fighter attacks. The combat box formation emerged, stacking bombers at staggered altitudes where overlapping fields of fire created protective bubbles of lead. Every mission revealed new challenges. At 25,000 feet, temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen equipment frequently malfunctioned, causing men to pass out or suffer judgment-impairing hypoxia. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes despite heated flight suits. Plexiglass windows frosted over, limiting visibility during critical moments. Guns jammed from cold or lack of proper lubrication. Equipment designed for moderate conditions failed catastrophically in stratospheric cold. January 27, 1943, exactly 1 year after the 8th's creation, brought perhaps its most ambitious raid yet. 53 bombers struck Wilhelmshaven, Germany's first attack on the Reich itself. The symbolic importance outweighed tactical results. American bombs were finally falling on German soil, fulfilling promises made to Soviet allies desperate for Western support. But 3 bombers went down over the North Sea, crews perishing in frigid waters within sight of home bases. German defenses grew increasingly sophisticated throughout 1943. Radar networks tracked incoming raids from takeoff, giving defenders crucial preparation time. Fighter controllers vectored interceptors to optimal attack positions. Anti-aircraft artillery ringed every significant target with steel curtains that shredded aluminum fuselages. Flak Fliegerabwehrken became the term American airmen feared most, watching black smoke puffs bloom around formations, each one capable of destroying an aircraft instantly. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission on August 17, 1943, demonstrated both the 8th's growing power and its vulnerability. 376 bombers launched in 2 waves targeting Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg and ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The raid succeeded in hitting both complexes, but German fighters exacted terrible revenge. 60 bombers failed to return, 600 men killed or captured in a single day. Formation leaders watched in horror as aircraft exploded, disintegrated, or spiraled down trailing smoke. Survivors returned shaken to their cores. Ground crews counted holes in battered aircraft, sometimes finding hundreds of punctures in single planes. Medical personnel treated wounded men whose injuries defied comprehension, gunners with legs severed by cannon shells, navigators blinded by shattered glass, pilots flying on morphine with abdominal wounds. The reality of strategic bombing became undeniable. This wasn't antiseptic warfare conducted from safe distances. This was close-quarters butchery at 5 miles altitude. Public relations officers struggled to present missions as victories when casualty rates approached 10%. Mathematicians calculated grim statistics at such rates. Bomber crews faced virtual impossibility of surviving 25 mission tours required before rotation home. Men stopped making long-term plans. They lived mission to mission, day to day, knowing odds tilted heavily against seeing 26th birthdays. October 14, 1943, forever entered 8th Air Force history as Black Thursday, the day when daylight bombing strategy nearly died over central Germany. Mission planners designated Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories for return visit, despite August's horrific losses. Intelligence insisted destroying these plants would cripple German war production, grinding tank treads and aircraft engines to halt without precision bearings. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses launched that autumn morning from East Anglian bases. Crews understood the dangers awaiting them. Schweinfurt lay deep inside Germany, beyond range of escort fighters. They would fly hundreds of miles defended only by their own guns against battle-hardened Luftwaffe pilots defending their homeland. Some men scribbled final letters before boarding aircraft, sealing envelopes they hoped would never be mailed. The outbound flight proceeded normally until crossing into German airspace, then hell erupted around them. Fighter controllers had concentrated nearly every available interceptor along the projected route. German pilots attacked with unprecedented aggression, making repeated passes despite heavy defensive fire. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs came at bomber formations from every angle above, below, head-on from flanks. Some fighters even dropped bombs into formations, hoping concussive blasts would knock bombers from the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up as formations approached Schweinfurt, adding dense flak to fighter assaults. The sky became a three-dimensional battlefield where death arrived from all directions simultaneously. Bombers staggered through explosions that rocked them like toys. Wingmen watched helplessly as squadron mates took direct hits, aircraft disintegrating in orange fireballs or breaking apart under structural stress. Parachutes blossomed tiny white flowers marking where men abandoned dying machines. Bombardiers released their loads through the chaos, bombs tumbling toward factories below. Photo reconnaissance would later show significant damage to bearing production facilities. But tactical success meant nothing to crews fighting for survival. The return flight became a gauntlet as German fighters pursued crippled bombers toward the coast. Aircraft with dead engines struggled to maintain altitude while wounded men bled in unheated fuselages. Some pilots ordered crews to bail out over France, hoping the resistance might hide them. Others pushed damaged planes toward England, willing them home through sheer determination. When surviving aircraft finally staggered back to bases, the accounting revealed catastrophic losses. 60 bombers failed to return 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. Another 17 aircraft crash-landed or were so damaged they never flew again. Of 291 aircraft launching that morning, barely 200 returned intact. Some groups lost over half their strength. Ground crews stood silently on hardstands, watching for planes they knew would never return. The psychological impact exceeded even physical losses. Men who had flown that mission returned hollow-eyed and shaking. They had watched friends die in ways that haunt dreams forever. Some crews refused to fly again, accepting court-martial over facing similar missions. Medical officers diagnosed increasing cases of combat fatigue, what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder. Young men aged decades in single afternoons. 8th Air Force commanders faced brutal reality. Current tactics and equipment could not sustain campaign against German industrial targets. Losses approached 30% on deep penetration raids, far exceeding replacement capacity. At such rates, the entire force would be destroyed within months without accomplishing strategic objectives. Something had to change or daylight bombing would be abandoned, validating British skepticism and surrendering European skies to Nazi Germany. The answer came not from new tactics or better bombers, but from unexpected source of fighter aircraft whose extended range would revolutionize aerial warfare and finally give heavy bombers the protection they desperately needed. November 1943 brought desperate discussions to 8th Air Force headquarters. General Eaker and his staff confronted an uncomfortable truth without fighter escort. Daylight bombing risked destruction of the entire force before accomplishing its mission. The Royal Air Force's concerns about daytime operations had proven prescient. German defenses were simply too formidable for unescorted bombers to survive in acceptable numbers. American aviation engineers had been wrestling with escort fighter range limitations since the campaign began. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts provided excellent protection close to England, but their combat radius barely reached German borders. Lockheed P-38s offered greater range but proved temperamental at high altitudes. What the 8th needed was a fighter, combining the Thunderbolts' fighting ability with range to reach Berlin and back, something most experts deemed aerodynamically impossible. The solution emerged from an unlikely source. North American Aviation's P-51 Mustang had entered service as a low-altitude tactical fighter with mediocre performance. British engineers experimented with replacing its American engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant driving Spitfires. The transformation proved revolutionary. The Merlin-powered Mustang combined speed, maneuverability, and most importantly, extraordinary range. December 1st, 1943, saw the first 51B models arrive in England. Pilots initially viewed them skeptically, accustomed to the rugged Thunderbolt. But first combat missions revealed the Mustang's capabilities. It could outrun, outclimb, and outmaneuver any German fighter while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers to targets previously considered unreachable. Adding external drop tanks extended range further, allowing Mustangs to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and engage defenders throughout entire missions. The impact on bomber operations proved immediate and dramatic. Luftwaffe fighters had grown accustomed to waiting beyond escort range before attacking. Suddenly, American fighters appeared over targets deep in Germany, catching defenders by surprise. German pilots found themselves fighting for survival instead of methodically destroying bombers. The psychological advantage shifted from defenders to attackers almost overnight. Fighter tactics evolved rapidly to exploit the Mustang's capabilities. Instead of staying close to bomber formations, fighters began free-ranging ahead, attacking German aircraft before they could organize assaults. Aggressive pilots like Captain Doan Salvatore Gentile and Lieutenant Colonel John Charles Meyer hunted enemy fighters, protecting bombers by destroying threats at their source. The fighter force transitioned from defensive shield to offensive weapon. German air defenses struggled to adapt. Fighter units accustomed to dominating their own airspace suddenly faced opponents who could engage them anywhere, anytime. Luftwaffe losses mounted as American pilots gained experience and confidence. Veteran German aces who had survived years of combat fell to determined Americans flying superior aircraft. The balance of air power over Europe began shifting inexorably toward the Allies. January 11, 1944, brought the first 8th Air Force raid to Berlin, escorted all the way by Mustangs. The psychological impact on German leadership exceeded tactical results. American bombers and fighters now ranged freely over the Reich capital, something Hermann Göring had promised would never happen. Each raid damaged Nazi morale while demonstrating American reach. Big Week in February 1944 showcased the transformed 8th Air Force. Between February 20th and 25th, over 3,000 bomber sorties struck aircraft factories across Germany, escorted by hundreds of fighters. The Luftwaffe rose to defend, committing its remaining strength in desperate battles. In 6 days of intense combat, German fighter forces suffered crippling losses, pilots and aircraft that could never be adequately replaced. The attrition broke the Luftwaffe's back. Training programs could not produce enough skilled pilots to replace casualties. Fuel shortages grounded available aircraft. Allied fighters dominated European skies, allowing bombers to operate with increasing impunity. The strategic bombing campaign that had seemed on the verge of failure just months earlier now pressed forward with unstoppable momentum. By spring 1944, the transformation was complete. The 8th Air Force had evolved from vulnerable force suffering unsustainable losses into dominant aerial armada capable of striking any target in Europe. The Mustang's arrival had solved the escort problem, but more importantly, it had enabled American fighters to destroy the Luftwaffe through aggressive offensive action. Control of European skies passed permanently to Allied forces, setting conditions for the invasion of Normandy. March 6, 1944, marked the first American bomber raid on Berlin in Force 814 aircraft, converging on the Nazi capital in broad daylight. The symbolic importance of striking Hitler's seat of power could not be overstated. Berliners had endured Royal Air Force night raids for years, but seeing American formations overhead in daylight demonstrated Allied aerial supremacy in ways that shook civilian morale to its foundations. The spring of 1944 brought relentless pressure as the 8th Air Force maintained an operational tempo that German defenses could not match. Nearly every day with acceptable weather saw massive formations launching from English bases. Targets ranged from aircraft factories to oil refineries, marshalling yards to submarine pens. The cumulative effect ground down German industrial capacity while forcing the Luftwaffe into battles of attrition it could not win. Oil became a priority target based on intelligence assessments of its critical importance to German military operations. Synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Merseburg, and Papeplitz endured repeated attacks despite heavy defenses. Each raid reduced production capacity, forcing German commanders to make increasingly difficult decisions about allocating scarce fuel resources. Tank formations sat idle for lack of gasoline. Training flights for new pilots were curtailed, creating a vicious cycle where inexperienced replacements fell quickly to veteran Allied pilots. The build-up to Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, consumed much of the 8th's effort in late spring 1944. Bombers pounded French transportation infrastructure, cutting rail lines and destroying bridges to isolate Normandy from reinforcements. Fighter bombers strafed rolling stock and attacked road convoys. The systematic destruction of French railways proceeded with such thoroughness that German commanders found it nearly impossible to move major units by rail. June 6, 1944 brought D-Day and validation of the 8th Air Force's months of preparation. Allied troops stormed Normandy beaches under near-total air superiority. Luftwaffe fighters barely appeared over the invasion fleet, kept at bay by overwhelming Allied fighter presence. Heavy bombers attacked coastal fortifications and choke points inland, supporting ground forces directly. The invasion succeeded partly because American and British air forces had battered German defenses into impotence through sustained strategic bombing. After D-Day, the 8th's mission expanded to include tactical support while maintaining strategic pressure. Bombers struck German positions in France, obliterating concentrations that threatened Allied advances. The carpet bombing of Saint-Lô in late July cleared the way for Operation Cobra, Patton's breakout from Normandy that sent American armor racing across France. Strategic bombing and tactical support merged into unified air campaign that gave ground commanders overwhelming advantages. As Allied armies pushed toward Germany's borders, bomber targets shifted to support the advance. The 8th attacked German garrison cities, disrupting defensive preparations. They struck communication centers, creating chaos in enemy command structures. Bridges over the Rhine became priority objectives, bombers working to trap German forces west of the river. Every mission served dual purpose, degrading Germany's war-making capacity while directly supporting ground operations. The intensity of operations took its toll even amid growing Allied dominance. Men still died on routine missions, shot down by lucky flak bursts, or experienced German pilots making desperate final stands. Aircraft collided in dense formations or suffered mechanical failures over enemy territory. Some crews disappeared without trace, listed as missing in action with no evidence of their fate. The 8th Air Force was winning the war, but victory came at steady cost in young lives. By autumn 1944, the transformation of European skies was complete. Where once German fighters had swarmed bomber formations with near impunity, Allied aircraft now ranged freely from England to Poland. The Luftwaffe existed only in fragments, scattered units with obsolete aircraft and undertrained pilots. Strategic bombing had achieved its primary objective of gaining air superiority, enabling everything that followed. But the human cost had been staggering. Thousands of American airmen lay dead in enemy territory or Allied war graves. Thousands more carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. January 1, 1945, saw the Luftwaffe launch Operation Bodenplatte, desperate New Year's Day surprise attack against Allied airfields in France and Belgium. Nearly 1,000 German fighters struck at dawn, catching many aircraft on the ground. Initial results appeared promising as flames consumed Allied planes. But the operation proved suicidal for Germany's remaining air strength. Luftwaffe losses exceeded 400 aircraft and 300 pilots, irreplaceable veterans, and their last modern fighters destroyed in a single day. The attack confirmed German desperation rather than demonstrating renewed strength. The 8th Air Force entered 1945 as an overwhelming force that German defenses could barely challenge. 1,000-plane raids became routine, massive formations that darkened skies for hours. Target selection expanded to include transportation networks, communication facilities, and even urban areas housing war industries. The distinction between strategic and tactical bombing blurred as bombers struck whatever targets might hasten German collapse. Oil installations remained priority objectives throughout winter 1944-45. Intelligence confirmed that fuel shortages were crippling German military operations across all fronts. Panzer divisions sat immobile for lack of gasoline. Fighter units could not intercept bomber formations without fuel. Training programs ceased entirely. Repeated attacks on synthetic fuel plants reduced German oil production to trickle, strangling mechanized warfare at its source. Dresden became synonymous with strategic bombing's controversial aspects when Allied forces devastated the city on February 13 and 14, 1945. The Royal Air Force struck at night, followed by 8th Air Force bombers during daylight. The raids created firestorms that consumed much of the historic city center. Estimates of civilian casualties ranged from tens of thousands to higher figures, disputed by historians. The attack generated controversy about whether such destruction served military necessity or crossed into terror bombing. According to research preserved in the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, the debate over Dresden reflected broader questions about strategic bombing's morality that persist decades later. Transportation targets dominated mission planning in the war's final months. Bombers systematically destroyed railway marshalling yards throughout Germany. Paralysis of the transportation network causing widespread shortages of food, fuel, and military supplies. Cities that had survived previous attacks suffered now because they contained critical rail junctions. The cumulative destruction reduced German logistics capacity to near zero, hampering military operations while causing civilian hardship. March 7, 1945, brought American ground forces to the Rhine at Remagen, where they captured an intact railway bridge before German engineers could destroy it. The 8th Air Force immediately shifted priorities to protecting this vital bridgehead. Bombers attacked German forces trying to reach Remagen while fighters maintained constant air cover. The bridge ultimately collapsed from damage, but engineers had already constructed temporary spans. The Rhine barrier, Germany's last natural defense, had been breached. As Allied armies penetrated Germany from east and west, bomber missions decreased in strategic importance but continued at high tempo. The 8th struck pockets of resistance, attacked remaining industrial facilities, and provided close support to ground forces. Targets grew scarce as Germany's economy collapsed and military formations disintegrated. Some missions proceeded more from momentum than military necessity. April 16, 1945, saw the 8th Air Force fly its final heavy bomber combat mission of the European War, an attack on Pilsen, Czechoslovakia's Koda armament works. The mission encountered minimal opposition, a stark contrast to savage battles of previous years. Crews returned knowing they had likely flown their last combat operation. The sense of relief mixed with exhaustion and loss for comrades who had not survived to see victory. The tally of 8th Air Force accomplishments defied easy comprehension. Over 300,000 missions flown. More than 700,000 tons of bombs dropped. Thousands of locomotives, factories, bridges, and military installations destroyed. German industrial production reduced to a fraction of its peak capacity, the Luftwaffe broken as fighting force. Air superiority achieved and maintained through final victory. But those impressive statistics came at terrible price. The 8th Air Force suffered higher casualties than any other American air unit in history. Over 26,000 men killed in combat, thousands more wounded or captured. Nearly 5,000 aircraft lost over enemy territory. Every statistic represented someone's son, brother, husband, or father who would never return home. May 8, 1945, brought victory in Europe Day and silencing of guns that had thundered for nearly 6 years. Across East Anglian air bases, men who had lived with constant threat of death finally allowed themselves to imagine futures beyond the next mission. Ground crews who had worked impossible hours keeping battle-damaged aircraft flying could rest. The war in Europe had ended, but processing what it had cost would take much longer. The human toll of strategic bombing exceeded anything experienced by previous American military forces. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Those numbers exceeded total American casualties in the Revolutionary War or War of 1812. For perspective, the 8th's casualty rate surpassed that of U.S. Marine Corps infantry during the Pacific Island campaigns. Flying bombers over Germany proved statistically more dangerous than storming fortified beaches. Individual bomber groups experienced losses that devastated tight-knit communities. The Bloody 100th Bomb Group earned its nickname through catastrophic casualties that saw entire squadrons wiped out on single missions. Other groups suffered similar fates. Men watched their barracks empty as friends disappeared, shot down over targets they could barely pronounce. The turnover rate meant some groups completely replaced their original personnel multiple times during the war. Survival often came down to luck as much as skill. A flak fragment that missed by inches meant the difference between completing a tour and dying over enemy territory. Engine failure over water meant near certain death in frigid seas. Bailing out over Germany offered slim chances. Angry civilians sometimes killed downed airmen before Wehrmacht soldiers could take them prisoner. Even successful bailouts led to prisoner-of-war camps where conditions ranged from harsh to brutal. Those who completed 25 mission tours and rotated home carried invisible wounds. Combat fatigue affected men differently. Some experienced nightmares that persisted for decades. Others developed anxiety or depression. Many struggled with survivors' guilt over comrades who had not returned. The term post-traumatic stress disorder would not be coined for another generation, but the 8th Air Force produced thousands of cases that went largely unrecognized and untreated. The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness remained controversial even as victory celebrations commenced. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey assessed damage to German industry and military capacity. The survey concluded that strategic bombing had significantly degraded German war production, destroyed the Luftwaffe, disrupted transportation networks, and diverted massive resources to air defense. However, German industrial output had actually increased through 1944 despite sustained bombing, raising questions about campaign efficiency. Critics argued that resources devoted to strategic bombing might have been better employed supporting ground operations or other military priorities. The bomber offensive required enormous investment: aircraft production, fuel, ordnance, and most importantly, highly trained crews. Each heavy bomber required 10 men, all needing extensive training. Fighter pilots demanded similar investment. The strategic bombing absorbed resources that might have shortened the war through alternative employment. Defenders countered that strategic bombing achieved objectives beyond simple industrial destruction. The campaign forced Germany to divert massive resources to air defense fighters, anti-aircraft guns, personnel that could not be used elsewhere. The Luftwaffe suffered in Russia partly because units remained in Germany defending against bomber raids. Anti-aircraft artillery that might have supported ground forces instead pointed skyward at bomber formations. The psychological impact of constant bombing disrupted German society and damaged civilian morale. The moral questions proved even more contentious. Strategic bombing intentionally targeted industrial areas within cities, accepting civilian casualties as inevitable consequence. While American doctrine theoretically distinguished between precision, daylight attacks on military targets and area night bombing practiced by the Royal Air Force, the practical difference diminished at 25,000 feet through clouds and smoke. Bombs intended for factories killed civilians in nearby neighborhoods. The firestorms that consumed Dresden raised uncomfortable questions about where legitimate military action ended and indiscriminate destruction began. These debates would continue for generations, occupying military historians, ethicists, and veterans themselves. The men who flew the missions held diverse views. Some believed they had done necessary work to end Nazi tyranny, whatever the cost. Others struggled with memories of burning cities below their aircraft. Most occupied middle ground, understanding war's cruel necessities while recognizing the terrible prices paid by all sides. The 8th Air Force did not disband with war's end, but instead continued as permanent component of United States Air Force structure, later serving in Cold War operations and modern conflicts. But its identity remained forever linked to those terrible years over Europe, when young men fought desperate battles in freezing skies. The mighty 8th became institution, mythology, and living memorial to extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Survivors returned to civilian life carrying experiences that set them apart from peers who had not shared their ordeal. Many never spoke about their service, finding memories too painful for casual conversation. Families sensed shadows their fathers and grandfathers carried but could not articulate. Reunions of bomb groups and fighter squadrons became settings where men could share experiences with others who understood. These gatherings grew more precious as years passed and veterans aged into their final years. The air bases in England from which the 8th operated gradually returned to agricultural use or were repurposed. Some became museums preserving memory of operations once conducted from their runways. Duxford, Polbrook, and other former bomber stations host commemorations where aging veterans and increasingly their descendants gather to honor sacrifice and remember fallen comrades. Local communities maintain memorials listing names of those who flew from nearby bases and never returned. Museums dedicated to 8th Air Force history emerged in both England and America. The National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force in Georgia displays aircraft, artifacts, and extensive exhibits chronicling the organization's history. Interactive displays allow visitors to experience conditions bomber crews faced, the cramped interiors, extreme cold, and constant danger. The museum serves both educational purpose and sacred memorial space where families connect with ancestors' service. Historical reevaluation of strategic bombing continues among scholars, military analysts, and public audiences. Modern precision-guided munitions make World War II-era bombing seem crude and wasteful. But judging past actions by present capabilities risks ahistorical conclusions. The 8th Air Force employed best technology available, facing defenses that made alternative tactics impossible. They accomplished mission assigned by military and civilian leadership who believed strategic bombing could shorten war and save lives ultimately. The human dimension transcends technical debates about effectiveness or morality. 26,000 American airmen died over Europe, most barely into their 20s. Each represented potential unrealized careers never pursued, families never formed, lives never lived beyond brief violent moments over enemy territory. Their sacrifice contributed to victory over genuine evil, making possible a world where democracy survived and fascism fell. For the veterans who survived, memory of lost comrades never faded. Names recalled across decades: pilots who died on first missions, navigators killed by flak over Schweinfurt, gunners who gave their parachutes to wounded crew members. These ghosts remain present throughout survivors' lives, honored through memory and periodic gathering with fellow veterans who shared knowledge of what those missions really cost. The legacy extends beyond individual sacrifice to collective achievement. The 8th Air Force helped demonstrate that sustained strategic bombing could support broader military objectives when executed properly. They proved that air power, employed correctly with appropriate resources, could achieve strategic effects impossible through other means. Modern Air Force doctrine traces lineage directly to lessons learned, often painfully, over Germany during World War II. Perhaps most significantly, the Mighty 8th embodied American industrial might and citizen soldier tradition. They proved that free societies could mobilize overwhelming force when threatened, that democracy's perceived weaknesses became strengths under pressure. Young men from every background and region united by common purpose, willing to face terrible dangers for cause larger than themselves. This remains the 8th Air Force's enduring legacy, not just military victory, but demonstration of democratic society's capacity to defend itself against totalitarian aggression. The story of how the mighty 8th Air Force helped win World War II encompasses triumph and tragedy, strategic success and terrible cost, justified necessity and troubling moral questions. It represents thousands of individual stories of courage, loss, survival, and sacrifice that collectively shaped history. As the last veterans pass into memory, preserving their story becomes increasingly important. The Mighty 8th's contribution to Allied victory stands as monument to a generation that faced extraordinary challenges and prevailed despite costs that can never be fully measured or adequately repaid.